I'm Lena. I'm 31. And 2 weeks before the Army pinned a silver star on my chest for pulling 2 wounded soldiers out of a burning vehicle under fire, my father called to tell me he wasn't coming to the ceremony. When I asked why, he said, "You've been an embarrassment since the day you turned your back on this family. You're this family's biggest shame, Lena. A medal doesn't change that." I believed for exactly 11 more days that he meant it the way it sounded, an old wound about me choosing the Army over his company at 19, never healed, finally said out loud. What I found out on day 12 was that his shame had nothing to do with my uniform at all. It had to do with a signature on a government contract document that wasn't mine, a forged notarization, and $12 million in federal contracts his company had no legal right to win. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, where the people who get called the shame of the family are usually the ones who end up exposing it. If you've ever been blamed for something that was never actually about you, stay with me until the end. Drop a comment and let me know you're here. I enlisted at 19, against every plan my father had ever made for me. Walter Brandt built Brandt Industrial Solutions from a 2-truck welding outfit into a mid-size manufacturing and construction supply company over 30 years, and for most of my childhood the plan was simple and unspoken. I'd study business, come home, eventually run it. I loved him. I loved the smell of his shop, the sound of the cutting torch, the pride in his voice when a big contract came through. I just never wanted to run it. The Army, when I found it, felt like the first thing in my life that was entirely specifically mine. He didn't come to my basic training graduation. He came, grudgingly, to my commissioning, standing at the back of the room in his good suit, arm crossed the whole ceremony. Over 12 years of service, our relationship settled into something civil, but distant. Holiday calls, birthday texts, the occasional strained dinner during leave. I told myself that was just who he was. A man who loved in a narrow, particular shape, and couldn't stretch it to include a daughter who'd chosen a different life than the one who'd planned for her. I believed that story for a very long time. It turned out to be only half true. My mother Diane was always the softer buffer between us, the one who called every deployment cycle to make sure I knew he was proud, even when he didn't say it directly, the one who kept a folder of every article that mentioned my unit, even when he claimed not to read them. My younger sister Ava went the opposite direction from me entirely, joining the family business straight out of college, learning the estimating software, sitting in on client calls, becoming, by every visible measure, the child my father had originally wanted. I never resented her for it. If anything, having Ava step into that role took some of the old pressure off me, freed me up to be the daughter who called from strange time zones instead of the one expected to inherit anything. The Silver Star notification came through my chain of command on a Tuesday, official orders following 2 weeks later. A formal ceremony, division level, press likely to attend given the citation's details. I called my mother first, and she cried, genuinely, the kind of crying that needs no translation. I called my father that evening, careful and a little hopeful, the way you get careful and hopeful about people who've disappointed you before, but who you still want, on some level, to surprise you. "That's really something, Lena," he said, and there was a strange flatness underneath the words that I noticed, but couldn't yet name. I asked if he'd come. He said he'd have to check some things, and would let me know. I remember hanging up and telling myself that have to check some things was progress, compared to some of our other conversations. I didn't yet understand how literally he meant it. I called Ava that same night, mostly to share the good news with someone who I knew would just be simply, uncomplicatedly happy for me. She was, loudly and immediately, already planning what she'd wear, and asking whether the ceremony would be televised locally. Somewhere in the middle of her excitement, though, she paused and said, almost to herself, "Dad's going to have to actually show up for this one, huh?" in a tone that struck me, even then, as an odd thing to say about a Silver Star ceremony, rather than an ordinary birthday dinner he sometimes skipped. A week later my younger sister Ava called, ostensibly to talk about the ceremony logistics, but she mentioned, almost in passing, that Dad had been weird and stressed for months, taking calls behind closed doors, snapping at people at the shop over paperwork nobody used to care that much about. Mom thinks it's a big new contract, Ava said. Government stuff apparently pretty lucrative, but he's been acting like it's more trouble than money. I asked what kind of government contract. She didn't know specifics. Nobody in the family, it seemed, knew specifics about anything Dad was working on lately, which struck me as strange for a man who'd spent 30 years talking about the business at every single family dinner, whether anyone wanted to hear it or not. I mentioned it to my mother, too, a few days later, casually, the way you mentioned something that's nagging at you without quite knowing why. She said he'd been sleeping poorly, that she'd found him at his desk at 2 a.m. twice that month, papers spread everywhere, and that when she'd asked what was wrong, he'd said only, "Just contract stuff, Diane, nothing you need to worry about," in a tone she said she hadn't heard from him since the company had nearly gone under, during a slow stretch years earlier. I remember thinking at the time that whatever this was, it sounded serious enough to actually be worth worrying about, and finding it strange that the one thing my father seemed most determined to keep from all of us was exactly that. 10 days before the ceremony, I called again to confirm logistics, hotel, timing, whether he and my mother would drive up together. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, flatly, "I'm not coming, Lena." I asked why, genuinely stunned, assuming some scheduling conflict I could work around. What came next wasn't a scheduling conflict. "You've been an embarrassment since the day you turned your back on this family," he said, his voice rising in a way I hadn't heard from him in years. "You picked the army over everything I built. You're this family's biggest shame, and I'm not going to stand in a room full of cameras pretending otherwise." He hung up before I could respond. I sat in my quarters holding a dead phone line, trying to reconcile a man calling his daughter's Silver Star ceremony a source of shame, and finding no version of that sentence that made sense with the father I thought I knew, even at his most disapproving. I called back twice within the hour, unable to leave it there. Both times went straight to voicemail. I typed out a long message, then deleted it, then typed a shorter one, then deleted that too, because nothing I could type felt like it matched the size of what had just happened. I finally settled on nothing at all, sat on the edge of my rack for a long time in the particular kind of silence that follows a sentence you know you're going to be turning over for a long time, and eventually got up and went to physical training, because staying still with it felt worse than moving. I didn't call anyone for 2 days after that. When I finally called my mother, she was careful, clearly caught between us, saying only that your father's under a lot of pressure right now, without elaborating further. Ava texted a single line, "He won't talk about it, sorry Lena," and then went quiet too. I understood, in the days that followed, that I wasn't going to get an explanation from anyone in my family. I was going to have to carry the ceremony, and whatever that sentence meant, entirely on my own. My unit noticed something was off, the way units do, without me ever having to explain it directly. My platoon sergeant, a woman who'd known me for 4 years and had a talent for asking exactly one question at exactly the right moment, caught me alone in the motor pool and asked simply, "Family stuff?" I said something vague and true enough. Old wounds, nothing new. She nodded, didn't push, and said only, "Well, you've got us in that room whether anyone else shows up or not," which was the first thing anyone had said to me in days that actually made the ceremony feel less like something I was dreading. I focused on my unit instead, on the logistics I could control, on the 2 soldiers I'd pulled out of that vehicle, both of whom were planning to be there in person, which mattered to me more than I let myself admit out loud. Some nights, though, alone in my quarters, I still replayed his sentence, turning biggest shame over and over, trying to find the version of it that was about the army and not about something else entirely. I haven't found it yet. 3 weeks after the call, back stateside on leave and helping a veteran-owned small business nonprofit review a mentee's federal contracting paperwork, something I'd started volunteering for after my last deployment, I was cross-referencing a business on the government's public contractor database, sam.gov, to show my mentee how ownership verification worked for service-disabled veteran-owned small business certification. On a whim, mostly out of habit, I typed in my father's company. Brant Industrial Solutions appeared in the results, certified as an SDVOSB, a designation reserved for small businesses at least 51% owned and controlled by a service-disabled veteran. Listed as the qualifying veteran owner, with a stated 51% ownership stake, was a name I recognized instantly because it was mine. My mentee, a young Marine veteran named Dorian, who I'd been helping navigate this exact process for his own small landscaping company, actually noticed my face change before I said anything. "You okay?" he asked. I told him I needed a minute, closed the laptop a little too quickly, and walked outside the community center where we'd been meeting, standing in the parking lot in the late afternoon heat, reading my own name off a government database that had no business knowing it existed, let alone attaching it to a company I had no ownership stake in. I stared at the screen a long time, certain, at first, that this had to be some kind of clerical mix-up, a common name, a database error, something explainable. I had never applied for SDVOSB certification. I had never transferred ownership interest in my father's company, which I'd never held any ownership interest in to begin with. I told myself, driving home that evening, that there was probably a simple explanation, and that if I called and asked plainly, my father would clear it up in one conversation, the same easy way most confusing things eventually get cleared up in families that actually talk to each other. I didn't call him first. I called the SBA's public information line instead, and requested, under my own name as the listed owner, a copy of the ownership documentation submitted with the certification. It took 11 days to arrive. Those 11 days were the last calm ones I had for a while. I kept my usual routine those 11 days, mostly out of discipline rather than genuine calm: physical training, mentoring sessions with Dorian, evenings spent telling myself the explanation was probably something boring, some kind of estate planning shortcut my father had taken without thinking through how it would look on paper. I even rehearsed a little the conversation where he'd laugh and say something like, "Oh, that old paperwork, your uncle's accountant handled that, it's nothing." And I'd feel silly for having worried. I want to be honest that some part of me was still hoping, right up until the envelope actually arrived, that I'd get to feel silly instead of what I actually ended up feeling. The documents that arrived were unambiguous: a membership interest transfer agreement dated 4 years earlier, showing 51% of Brant Industrial Solutions, transferred into my name, notarized, my signature at the bottom in ink that looked, at a glance, close enough to mine to pass a casual review. I had never signed anything like it. I had been stationed overseas the week the document claimed I'd signed it stateside, a fact I could prove within an hour using nothing more than my own official travel orders. I sat with that folder on my kitchen table a long time, my own name staring back at me from a document I had no memory of, attached to a company that had apparently been using my military service to win contracts I knew nothing about. I understood, finally, with a cold clarity that made my hands go still, instead of shaking, exactly what biggest shame might actually have meant, and that it had almost certainly never been about the Army at all. I pulled my own travel orders from that period within the hour, the exact kind of document the Army trains you to keep organized without ever imagining you'd someday need it as evidence against your own father. Deployment orders, movement dates, assigned accountability roster placing me on the exact date the transfer agreement claimed I'd signed it in a stateside attorney's office, roughly 6,000 miles away, on a forward operating base with limited outgoing communications. I photographed every page, organized them chronologically, and understood, laying them out across my kitchen table next to the fraudulent agreement, that I now had something no family conversation could talk its way around. I spent the following week pulling every public record I could access on my own, before deciding what to do next. Brant Industrial Solutions had been awarded, over the previous 3 years, more than $12 million in federal contracts, specifically set aside for service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses. Infrastructure supply contracts the company would very likely not have qualified for otherwise, competing instead in the open market against much larger firms. $12 million won on the strength of a designation built entirely on a signature I had never given. I understood the legal weight of that number even before I called an attorney. The False Claims Act allows for treble damages on fraudulently obtained federal contracts, meaning the company's actual exposure, if this ever came to light through official channels, could run well past $30 million, along with real criminal liability for whoever had orchestrated the fraud. My father's late-night calls, his sudden aversion to cameras, his sentence about shame, all of it reorganized itself instantly into a different, much more coherent shape. I spent an evening cross-referencing the individual contract award notices, one by one, against Brandt Industrial's project history that I remembered from childhood dinner table conversations, a highway guardrail, supply contract, a federal building retrofit, a base infrastructure order, each one significant enough on its own that I'd half remembered my father mentioning it as the big one at some point over the past 3 years. Seeing them listed together, total appended at the bottom of the SBA's award history, made the number feel less abstract and considerably more frightening. This wasn't one lapse in judgment. It was a sustained, multi-year pattern, repeated deliberately every time a new opportunity came up worth chasing. Here's what I finally understood. Sitting at my kitchen table with the transfer agreement and a printout of the contract totals side by side, my father hadn't refused to attend my ceremony because he was ashamed of the Army. He'd refused because a decorated combat veteran, publicly celebrated, photographed and profiled by local press, was the single worst possible spotlight he could imagine, pointed anywhere near a company whose biggest recent contracts depended entirely on that same veteran's identity being used without her knowledge. My medal wasn't the shame. My medal was the risk. I thought about every strained, distant conversation we had over 12 years, all of it filtered in my memory, through the story he'd let me believe. That I'd embarrassed him by choosing a life he hadn't planned for me. I understood, sitting there, that some of that story might have been true once. That the version of it that had just cost me a phone call 2 weeks before my Silver Star ceremony wasn't about disappointment at all. It was about fear of exposure, dressed up as an old wound so I'd never think to look any closer. I called a military legal assistance attorney first, through my JAG office, who reviewed what I had and immediately referred me to a civilian attorney specializing in False Claims Act cases, a man named Everett Sable, who'd handled several federal contracting fraud matters. He was quiet for a moment after I laid it all out, then said the sentence that changed how I understood my own position in all of it. "You're not just a bystander here, Lena. Legally, on paper, you're the majority owner of a company under federal investigation risk. The single most important thing you can do for your own protection is get ahead of this rather than wait to see if it surfaces on its own." I'd spent 12 years believing my family saw me as the one who'd walked away. For the first time, I understood I was actually the one holding the only piece of paper that could stop whatever my father had built from collapsing on top of people who had nothing to do with it, including, potentially, me. Everett asked me to send everything I had before our next call, the SBA documentation, my travel orders, screenshots of the SAM.gov listing. He called back 2 days later, having reviewed all of it, and said something that stuck with me for the rest of that week. "In most fraud cases I see, the person harmed is a stranger to the wrongdoer. What makes yours unusual and honestly makes it more urgent is that the fraud specifically required your identity to work at all. That's not incidental. Someone made a very deliberate choice to use exactly you, and I think you deserve to understand why before this moves any further." Everett laid out my options plainly. I could quietly demand my name be removed from the company's ownership records and walk away, hoping the fraud simply stopped without ever becoming my problem legally. I could confront my father directly, privately, and give him a chance to unwind it himself before anyone official got involved. Or I could pursue a formal whistleblower disclosure under the False Claims Act's qui tam provisions, which would protect me legally as a non-consenting, unknowing party, while formally putting the fraud on the government's radar through the proper channel rather than letting it continue. I thought about the 2 soldiers I'd pulled out of that burning vehicle, about what it had meant to sign my name to a citation that was entirely verifiably true. I thought about a different signature, forged, sitting in a federal database next to my name for 4 years without my knowledge. I understood, sitting in my car outside Everett's office, that whatever I chose next, there was no version of my family left where I could pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. I called my platoon sergeant that night, mostly because I needed to say the whole thing out loud to someone who'd tell me the truth without flinching. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "You didn't spend 12 years learning to leave people behind in a bad situation. Don't start now just because this one happens to be your father." It wasn't advice exactly, it was just a reminder of who I already knew I was, delivered by someone who'd watched me prove it under conditions considerably worse than a mediation room, and it settled something in me that had been unsettled since that first phone call. I chose to start with my father directly, one last time, mostly because some part of me still needed to know whether he'd tell me the truth if I gave him the chance before lawyers were fully involved. I drove to the shop instead of calling, walked into his office without an appointment, and set the transfer agreement on his desk without a word. He went pale reading it, pale in a way I'd never once seen from him in 31 years, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. "I can explain," he finally said, which is rarely, in my experience, followed by an actual explanation that helps. I told him he had exactly one chance to tell me the truth before I involved an attorney formally, not a version of it he thought I could handle. He sat down heavily in his chair, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, my father looked less like the man who'd built an empire out of a 2-truck welding shop, and more like someone who'd been drowning quietly for years, hoping nobody would notice before he found his own way back to shore. What he told me that afternoon wasn't the whole truth, I'd learn later, but it was more than I'd had that morning. He admitted the SDVOSB certification existed, admitted my name was on it, and claimed, unconvincingly, that he'd intended it as a formality, a way to keep the business in the family on paper, nothing that was ever meant to actually cost you anything. He didn't explain the forged signature, he didn't explain the notarization. When I pressed on those specific points, he went quiet in a way that told me, plainly, there was more underneath his half-explanation than he was willing to hand me voluntarily. I left the shop that day without resolution, but with something I hadn't had before, confirmation, from his own mouth, that the certification was real and that he'd known about it. I called Everett from the parking lot, and told him I was ready to move forward formally. He didn't try to talk me out of it. He only asked whether I understood that filing a disclosure meant this could no longer be undone quietly, family to family. I told him I understood completely, and that quietly had already cost me more than I was willing to keep paying for. Driving home that evening, I passed the exit for the shop 3 separate times before I actually took the highway toward my own apartment. Instead, some old habit in me still wanting to circle back and try one more conversation, certain that if I just found the right words, my father would hand me the rest of the truth voluntarily. I didn't take that exit. I understood, finally, that the version of my father willing to hand over the rest of that truth voluntarily might not exist, and that waiting for him to become that version of himself wasn't a plan, it was just another way of protecting him at my own expense. Everett's investigator, digging into the transfer agreement's notarization block, found something my father's half-explanation hadn't accounted for. The notary listed on the document, a woman named Priscilla Doyle, had her commission formally revoked by the state 2 years before the document's stated signing date, meaning the entire notarization was invalid on its face, filed years after the notary legally had no authority to notarize anything at all. Whenever its investigator reached her by phone, she was reluctant at first, then admitted, quietly, that she'd known my father for years through the local Chamber of Commerce, and had agreed, as what she'd understood to be a small favor, to stamp a document she'd never actually witnessed being signed. She hadn't realized, she said, that her commission had already lapsed by then, or that the document would end up attached to millions of dollars in federal contracts, rather than whatever minor family paperwork she'd assumed it was. It was one more layer of fraud stacked on top of the first, and it confirmed, beyond any doubt, that the signature at the bottom of that agreement had never been mine. Everett walked me through what the invalid notarization actually meant legally, beyond simply corroborating the forgery. A properly executed notarization is supposed to be one of the government's core safeguards against exactly this kind of fraud. An independent witness confirming identity and voluntary signature. Learning that the safeguard itself had been faked, not just skipped, made the whole scheme feel less like a single moment of bad judgment and more like a pattern someone had gotten comfortable relying on. People don't usually stumble into forging a notarization, Everett said. That's a deliberate workaround, done by someone who already understood exactly what the rules required and decided to fake compliance with them rather than actually follow them. I called my mother the same week, not my father, because I needed one honest conversation before this went any further. She started crying before I'd finished explaining what the investigator had found. "I've known for over a year," she said. "Not from the beginning, but I found the paperwork by accident, going through his files for something unrelated. I confronted him and he begged me not to say anything, said it would destroy everything we'd built, the house, his reputation, maybe worse. I told myself I was protecting the family by staying quiet. I don't think that's actually what I was doing anymore." I asked her gently whether that explained his cruelty on the phone before the ceremony. She was quiet a long moment, then said, "I think your father has spent months terrified that the moment people started paying real attention to you, they'd start paying attention to him too. He didn't know how to say that honestly, so he said something cruel instead because cruel felt safer than admitting he was scared." Hearing her say it out loud didn't undo the sentence. It just gave the sentence, finally, a shape I could understand instead of one I'd spent weeks turning over in the dark. I asked her why she hadn't told me sooner, not accusingly, just genuinely wanting to understand. "I kept thinking he'd fix it himself," she said. "Every month I gave him a little more time, telling myself that was patience, when I think it was actually just fear of what would happen to all of us the moment it stopped being fixable quietly." I told her I understood that fear better than she probably realized, since I'd spent the last several weeks negotiating with a version of the exact same instinct in myself. Neither of us had an easy answer for how long is too long to protect someone from a truth that's already loose in the world. We just sat with that question together for a while, which was, in its own way, more honest than either of us had managed with each other in years. With the notarization confirmed fraudulent, and my mother's account corroborating my father's knowledge, Everett filed a formal whistleblower disclosure with the Department of Justice under the False Claims Act, laying out the forged transfer agreement, the invalid notarization, and the contract history, while formally establishing my status as a non-consenting, unknowing party whose identity had been used without authorization. It was a serious step, and I understood, signing the disclosure, that there was no soft version of what came next. My father's company was now the subject of a federal fraud referral, and my name sat at the center of the filing that started it, on the correct side of the paperwork for the first time in 4 years. My father called 11 times over the following week. I let most of them go to voicemail, not out of cruelty, but because I'd learned, over the previous month, that answering immediately had never once gotten me an honest answer from him. "Just want you to know what you did that day was real. Nobody can take that off the record, no matter what else is happening." I hadn't told him anything about my father. He'd simply noticed the empty seat and understood, the way people who've been through something together sometimes understand things without needing them explained. I thanked him, and meant it more than I probably showed in that moment, standing there in dress uniform with a medal on my chest and an empty chair 15 feet away. Federal investigators contacted my father's attorney 4 weeks after the disclosure was filed, moving with the particular unhurried thoroughness of an agency building a case, rather than reacting to one. My father, on his attorney's advice, cooperated fully once contact was made, providing records, confirming the timeline, acknowledging the certification had been obtained using my identity without my consent. Everett told me that cooperation, combined with my own proactive disclosure, would very likely keep this in civil settlement territory rather than criminal prosecution, though nothing was guaranteed until the investigation formally closed. A sit-down mediation was arranged 6 weeks later, at Everett's office, both attorneys present, my mother there too, my father sitting across the table from me looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. He didn't reach for an excuse this time. "I panicked when the last big contract cycle nearly sank us," he said. voice unsteady in a way I'd never once heard from him. Priscilla's stamp was supposed to be a temporary fix, something I'd unwind once things stabilized. It never stabilized, and every month that went on, the truth got harder to say out loud, until the only thing I knew how to do was keep you as far away from the company, and from me, as I possibly could, and I told myself that was protecting you, when really it was protecting myself. The mediator asked him plainly why he'd chosen cruelty specifically, why the sentence he'd reached for hadn't simply been, "I can't come, I'm dealing with something difficult," but instead, something designed to wound. My father sat with that question a long time before answering it. "Because if I'd told you the truth, you'd have wanted to help me fix it," he finally said. "And I couldn't stand the idea of you fixing something I'd broken, not after everything I'd already taken from you without asking. Pushing you away felt like the only way I still knew how to protect you from me." It wasn't an excuse, but it was the first time my father had ever described his own cruelty, honestly instead of simply delivering it, and something in that room shifted once he finally said it out loud. The mediator, once the personal admission settled, laid out the practical path forward. The fraudulent SDVOSB certification would be formally revoked. The company would enter a structured settlement with the SBA and DOJ involving restitution tied to be improperly awarded contracts, spread across a repayment schedule rather than a single ruinous penalty, largely because of the company's full cooperation and my own early disclosure, and my name would be permanently, formally cleared of any ownership interest or wrongdoing in every relevant federal record. I didn't push for criminal charges against my father, though Everett confirmed the investigation's outcome was ultimately the government's call, not mine, and that outcome, once finalized months later, did land on the civil settlement side rather than prosecution, largely on the strength of the cooperation record we'd all helped build. What I wanted most, sitting in that mediation room, wasn't to watch my father go to prison. It was simply for the truth to exist somewhere permanent, official, and undeniable, a version of events that could never again be quietly rewritten into a story about my own supposed shame. Rebuilding what was left cost real things, months of legal proceedings, a public disclosure that briefly turned local business press attention toward my family in ways none of us had wanted, and a version of my relationship with my father that will likely never return to what it was before that phone call. I don't regret filing the disclosure. I understand now that the version of me who might have quietly demanded my name removed and walked away, letting the fraud continue for whoever might come after me, would have been protecting a peace that was never actually fair to protect. I think often about the two soldiers I pulled out of that vehicle, about what it means to put your name behind something entirely true. My father spent years putting my name behind something false and calling my honesty the family's shame instead. I understand now exactly which one of those two things was called actually shameful, and it was never the metal. 6 months after the settlement, my father wrote me a letter, an actual letter, not a text, not a call, the kind he'd apparently decided the situation finally warranted. It didn't excuse anything. It didn't ask me to forget anything. It simply said, in his own handwriting, that he understood now what fear had cost him, that watching me stand at that ceremony without him in the audience had been the loneliest moment of his own life. Worse, he wrote, than anything the settlement had cost the business. He asked if he could take me to dinner sometime. No business talk, no explanations, just dinner. I said yes. It was, so far, the most honest single request he'd made of me in over a decade. It's been a little over a year now. Brand Industrial Solutions still exists. Smaller, cleaner, no longer bidding on set-aside contracts. It was never legitimately entitled to win. My father works fewer hours these days by choice, something none of us ever thought we'd see. My mother finally told me, over coffee a few months ago, that she sleeps better now than she has in 2 years, no longer carrying a secret she'd never wanted to hold in the first place. Ava and I talk more than we used to, mostly because we finally had one real conversation instead of years of careful, comfortable distance. Last month, my father asked to come to a much smaller event, a local veterans organization dinner, where I was giving a short talk. Nothing with cameras, nothing with press. He sat in the third row the whole time, and afterward, he shook my hand the way you'd shake the hand of someone he respected before he pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than either of us probably expected it to. I keep the citation from my silver star framed in my apartment now, next to the letter he finally wrote. Different kinds of honesty, I've learned, arrive on very different timelines. I'm glad both of them eventually arrived at all. Ava told me recently that she'd started keeping her own copy of every contract the company bids on now, not out of suspicion exactly, just habit. A small private safeguard she picked up somewhere in the middle of watching all of this unfold. I think that's probably the truest legacy of the whole ordeal. Not a single dramatic reconciliation, but a family that finally understands, in a way none of us did before, that love and honesty were never supposed to be two separate things you chose between, even when choosing honesty is the harder, lonelier, and by far the better option. That's my story. One cruel phone call, one forged signature, and a family finally telling the truth about which one of us was actually the shame all along. If this reminded you that being blamed doesn't mean you were wrong, take that as your sign today. Share it with someone who's ever been made to carry a shame that was never actually theirs. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.